A room with white walls. Except for a window that is too small to be smaller, there is only a heavy iron door. On the bed in the room sits a slender girl whose face is completely covered by black hair. Live, people can't see the look at the moment. Number 17, someone came to visit you today. A gap was opened on the iron gate, and a gust of wind blew in from the outside. The girl's body moved, and finally raised her head, a pale white. There was no blood on his small face, and a pair of hollow black eyes stared at the front blankly. Ripples. A sentimental call made the little girl turn her head slightly. When she saw the bloodshot eyes outside the gap of the iron gate, the girl slowly walked off the bed and walked to the door. Ripples, my ripples! The man outside seemed to cry a little, his bright red eyes were full of pain and reluctance. The girl inside the iron gate is his daughter, his daughter. Dad, you are here. The girl smiled when she saw the man's eyes. Her little hand was about to touch the iron gate, but a strong electric current came from the iron gate, and the girl twitched and fell to the ground. Ripples, ripples! The man slapped the iron gate with madness in his eyes. The supervisor standing outside immediately pulled the man away. The man was dragged out, his eyes fixed on the iron gate, loudly. Roar, you bastards, give me my daughter back, give it back to me. The man's shouts grew farther and farther until he could no longer hear them. A man in a white coat came over and looked at the iron gate for a long time. Who let him in? The other staff were silent, and the man stopped asking, took the data book on the wall and opened it. How is her status today? The state of number 17 is fairly stable, and it will be retested soon. The man nodded, carefully observing the data in the notebook, with a faint smile at the corner of his mouth, and within the iron gate, the little girl who was stunned by the electric current got up from the ground. Just now the father's roar still echoed in her ears. The girl's empty black eyes stared at the iron gate. Suddenly, the corners of her mouth lifted up, and a pair of godless eyes suddenly surged into hostility. Soon, soon. This is the most hidden advanced research institute, located underground, serving secretly for a big country, searching for humans with abilities in the world, and then conducting continuous experiments in an attempt to extract these abilities and integrate them into ordinary humans. Today is the day when number 17 is experimenting. Number 17 is the most perfect recipient found by the Research Institute. The experiment of number 17 also attracted many senior executives. If number 17 succeeds, it represents a historic step for this experiment. The girl's body has many tubes and wires of different colors. All the indicators of her body are precisely analyzed on the computer. The experiment is going on intensely. When the staff pushes the white liquid in the test tube to the girl when the child is in the body, the data on the computer is spinning fast. The high-levels kept their eyes on the computer screen, holding their breath, looking at the numbers that rose suddenly. Everyone couldn't help but breathe quickly. The numbers kept rising violently, making everyone's breathing rise accordingly. When the critical value was reached, the computer sounded like an alarm, but the number still did not stop. Everyone was stunned. Looking at the number that continued to rise, one person shouted, "Perfect, it's so perfect. We succeeded, ha 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 ha, we succeeded." The eyes of the senior executives are wide open, and there is enthusiasm and anticipation in them. So far number 17 is their only successful case. How can this not make them excited? Decades of scientific research finally produced satisfactory results. Take a sample, and you're done. The executives were ecstatic and delighted at the praise and rewards they were about to get. The staff in the laboratory were also planning to take samples from the girls' bodies and keep the samples, then the experiment would be complete. The girl who was lying on the test bench with her eyes closed at this moment suddenly opened her eyes. Her empty black eyes were no longer there, and there was a terrible anger jumping in it, and the staff were still in ecstasy. No one noticed the girl's performance. The girl's black eyes swept toward the joyful high-levels behind the glass, and the corners of her mouth were coldly drawn. I saw one of those high-level people frowned, and finally squatted down holding his head. There seemed to be some confusion outside. Puff. It seemed that something was bursting. The staff in the laboratory didn't know. So, only seeing some commotion outside, when they didn't think it was, a bright red sprayed on the glass window, shocking everyone's eyes. The girl raised her mouth coldly. No, just one, it's not enough. The staff in the laboratory stared at the red on the glass window in a daze, and then one after another high evil eyes hugged their heads and squatted down, puff, puff and puff, continuously boring. There was a sound, and red blood columns spewed out one after another, sprinkled on the glass window, and even mixed with white and yellow. The staff were all dumbfounded, like a stone statue. This sudden fear made them stand in place. Until the people who were still alive outside pointed at them with horror with their hands, the staff seemed to understand something. Everyone turned their heads almost at the same time. Every pair of eyes full of fear looked at the experimental platform. At this moment, she had sat up, with a smile at the corner of her mouth, and the irony and hatred in her black eyes made everyone back. Chills. Yes, yes, it's you. A staff member was shaking and unable to say a complete sentence. He could only look at the girl tremblingly and breathe. The girl's eyes swept, and for a moment, the staff member only felt a headache, as if a gas had been drilled into his mind, and the gas was expanding and expanding until it rushed out of the tightly closed head. Free. Puff. A human head exploded under the eyes of everyone. For a while, breathing stopped. All the staff suddenly screamed, "Quickly, quickly get out of here!" Everyone flocked to the laboratory frantically at the door. They don't want to die, they don't want to die. A pair of slightly rough hands wandered around her face. With a slight tremor, Yun Lianyi's heart trembled, and a warm current was slowly injected. Yun Sheng, the big brother who loved her so much, was willing to do the big brother she does anything. "Shenger, don't be like this." An old voice sounded, with irresistible anger and regret. Yun Lianyi's soul trembled again. That was his father, who had been pampering her since childhood. "I'm going to kill that little bunny, I'm going to skin him." Yun Sheng. Shut up your mouth. An angry shout made Yun Sheng's words come to an abrupt end, leaving only a panting voice. Yun Lianyi lying there quietly, a pain in her heart. "Shenger, the only thing left in the Yun family is you. You can't do this for the Yun family." The old voice had helplessness, and also had the dignity and responsibility of being the head of the Yun family. Yun Sheng stopped talking, but closed his eyes. Yun Lianyi can still feel the suppressed anger from him, with sorrow and irresistible regret. It's enough for the Yun family to have you. Fenger's hatred is to be reported for his father. The old voice suddenly rose. Anyone who has hurt Fenger will not be let go for the father. Zuji's words are sonorous and powerful. It was as if a sharp iron tool had chiseled this sentence into the boulder, exuding a little spark. "Father." Yun Sheng's surprised voice came, and then the old voice sounded again. "Shenger, you leave here immediately. Since your father wants to avenge Fenger, you are ready to burn the jade and stone. For the Yun family, you have to live no matter what." There was a mourn in the depths of the soul. Yun Lianyi listened quietly. Her heart was like a volcanic eruption, magma was rolling. She and her father depended on each other in the previous life, and her father is her all. Feng's father and eldest brother guarded her like a destiny, regardless of life and death for her. At this moment, I am Yunfen, and Yunfen is myself. A burst of power from the soul urged Yun Lianyi to open her heavy eyelids. She wanted to take a look at her elder brother and her father. The light flooded into the eyes. Yun Lianyi's pupils reflexively tightened. After adapting to the light, what was greeted by the thin back of a young man, the back showed loneliness and desolation, and his clenched fists were violent. Up! There was only one young man in the room. The old man who had just spoken was no longer there. Yun Lianyi squirmed his lips, as if some restriction had been broken. His hoarse voice sounded, "Big brother." The young man's back turned abruptly, trembling, as if he couldn't believe what he heard. Yunfeng's opened black eyes stared at the back, and an unspeakable sourness surged in his heart, and he wanted to shout again. But found that the throat seemed unwilling to cooperate, and a fire burned violently in the throat. The youth suddenly turned around in the next second. Yun Lianyi suddenly saw a face of sadness and joy, those flushed eyes and bloodshot eyes. The handsome facial features of the young man looked at the open eyes with a trace of ecstasy. Yun Lianyi couldn't say anything unexpectedly. Suddenly, the young man's body swiftly rushed towards Yun Lianyi's bed, and his trembling hands slowly stroked Shang Yun Lianyi's face. "Feng'er is awake, Feng'er is awake." Seeing the young man's almost crying face, Yun Lianyi couldn't help but sore his nose, and her black eyes were slightly moist. Family affection kept rippling in her heart. What she saw was her relatives, the beloved eldest brother in this life. "Oh yes, I have to tell my father, father he." The youth suddenly thought of something after ecstasy. His face was anxious, but he did not move his figure. His black eyes were still staring at the cloud ripples that opened his eyes, for fear that this would be the case. A dream, for fear that all this is just his illusion. Yun Lianyi only warmed up in her heart. The incomplete family affection from the previous life seemed to be filled in this life. Yun Lianyi could not speak at this moment, but could only tell the youth with her eyes that she was fine and that she was still alive. The young man watched this for a while, and finally confirmed the fact that his sister had indeed come alive. He didn't dare to delay any more, wiped his eyes with a big hand, and quickly got up. "Feng'er, wait, I'm going to find my father." As soon as the words fell, the person had disappeared in the room. Yun Lianyi looked at the young man's leaving back, and the corners of her mouth slightly raised. Although she didn't know where it was, she also understood that she was already a dead person. Now that she has regained her new life, "Yun Feng, let me live in your place. Your eldest brother, your father, and your Yun family will take good care of you. Naturally, none of the murderers who killed you will be let go. Ever." Yun Feng was lying on the bed quietly, feeling his soul and the body gradually merged. Maybe because of the new arrival, the union of the body and the soul is not perfect. Accepting all the memories of the body, Yun Feng is also quietly combing what she knows. This is a different space, which is very different from the earth she was in before. The vast continent, this is the name of the land she lives on. The vast continent is boundless, and the area is amazing, and the residents on this continent are also as many as cows. The middle area of the ridge is a high ridge like a triangular fork, which divides the continent into three from the middle. The ridge is inhabited by many monsters, and its strength is unpredictable. This ridge has also become a natural barrier of three divided land. So gradually, the vast continent was divided into three parts: the eastern continent, the western continent and the middle continent. It is said that the periphery of the vast continent is an ocean. Since the sea is wider than the continent, no one can reach the end. It is also said that the sea is extremely fierce, so it is named the Endless Sea. What is at the end of the Endless Sea, no one knows so far. The three continents are separated by ridges, and the possibility of aggression against each other is very small, because it is impossible to cross the terrifying ridge of monsters. The three empires on the western continent used to be a big fan, entangled with hundreds of thousands of troops wanting to force it. Across the ridge of Warcraft, all of them were buried, and none of them survived. Since then, the three continents have been in peace, and the lesson of blood tells everyone that it is the rule to guard 1 acre of land. The town of Chunfeng, where the Yun family is located, is a small town under the Kalan Empire among the 4 empires of the eastern continent. Although it is a small town, due to the geographical location of Chunfeng town, the Kalan Empire is the closest of the 4 empires of the eastern continent to the ridge of Warcraft. The town of Spring Breeze is the only place where the Karan Empire borders the Warcraft ridge, so it has become a paradise for adventurers. A small town is famous for relying on the Warcraft ridge alone. There are countless capable people and strangers coming and going, and Chun Breeze the town has gradually become a small place that the Karen Empire cannot ignore. The Yun family is one of the 3 local families in Chunfeng town. Before Chunfeng town was not yet well known, it was already rooted here. It has been passed down for thousands of years and has a profound heritage. The Yun family was once a very glorious family. It has been in Chunfeng town for hundreds of years. These are the existences that other families can only look up to, not only because the Yun family has a rich family background and so much wealth, but also because a summoner appeared in the Yun family 100 years ago. Summoner, a mysterious profession that no one knows in the vast continent, countless people yearn for it, and countless people are heartbroken. Summoners, like magicians, use their own mental power to communicate with various elements of nature. However, the biggest difference between summoners and magicians is that they can control those powerful and fierce monsters. A summoner can match the Empire's thousands of troops, and as long as he summons his own monsters, he can be overwhelmed and invincible. Although the magician and the warrior are equally powerful and indestructible, in front of the summoner, this mysterious and powerful profession, the two can only lower their heads. What makes the summoner even more maddening is that because of the same use of mental power, the summoner has a deep knowledge of magic. A summoner must be a magician, and a magician wants to have the ability of a summoner. It is undoubtedly a foolish dream. The power of the summoner is not only the power of its own magic, but also the most important factor, the summoner's monster. Warcraft, the most terrifying and powerful existence in the vast continent, the mystery of this race of Warcraft is no less than the mystery of the summoner. They are mysterious, powerful, and ferocious. In the depths of the ridge of Warcraft, I don't know how many humans can't dormant. Understanding creatures, but judging from the types of monsters known to mankind, it was already shocking enough. If a warrior or magician does not have a strong strength, he would never dare to be oneonan with a beast, but unlike summoners, their mysterious power can turn a beast into their own use, and others would not dare to touch it in the hands of the summoner. The demon of beast is as clever as a pet. This will make many people read. All kings of the empire went crazy hoping that a summoner would appear in their country. Once they have a summoner, it means they have a powerful monster and a mysterious existence. If the summoner can continue to grow, then the empire that owns him will also be invincible, and other countries will always be underfoot. However, the mystery and power of summoners are also destined to be scarce and scarce in this profession. There have only been no more than 5 summoners in the eastern continent over the past millennia. Due to the bloodline, the number of fighters on the eastern continent is astonishing. The achievement of development on this road is located at the top of the pyramid. The physical body is strong and developed, and the strength is strong. This makes the 4 empires of the East continent have indestructible military power. The empires also advocate power. Although the natural spiritual power is weak, the East continent there are also quite a few magicians, although they are incomparable with the number of warriors. However, everyone in the East continent has a desire in their hearts. Although most of them are inherently destined to not achieve spiritually, it does not prevent everyone from having a dream, dreaming of becoming a summoner. Every child is given the expectation of the summoner when he is born. Although the result is the same, everyone is enthusiastic about it, looking forward to generation after generation, and the expectations of thousands of years have finally come to fruition. Although the summoners there are fewer than 5 in thousands of years, but it is enough to make everyone crazy, and it will make the country that owns them crazy. How lucky is the Karen Empire to have a summoner, and this summoner was born in this little Yun family. From then on, the Yun family rose to the sky in one step and became the most respected family of the Karen Empire, an existence that everyone can only look up to. Just because of that summoner, the king gave the Yun family countless wealth and fame. Even the royal children had to bow down and salute in front of the Yun family. All the glory of this came from the role of the summoner, and the Yun family became Kalan. The hope of the empire: when a summoner appears, it is possible that a second one will appear. If the Yun family can have a summoner for generations, even if it is one, then the Karen Empire will be the first and the most powerful among the 4 empires. However, the hope slowly fades with the passage of time. The summoner born in the Yun family has long since died, and after hundreds of years, no summoner will appear in the Yun family, just like any ordinary family, even magic. The teachers are so pitiful. Gradually, the royal family's enthusiasm for the Yun family became less and less. The Yun family even returned from the imperial capital to this spring breeze town. As time accumulates, the once beautiful and respected Yun family has faded out of people's vision. The legendary summoner remained in the depths of people's memory. The Yun family returned to this small town with the accumulated wealth. Originally, the other families were still shocked by the glory of the Yun family. However, in the last 100 years, the Yun family has completely declined. Ordinary fighters are also mediocre. Slowly, the look of respect disappears. Instead, they ridicule and ridicule. Without strong strength, all glory is empty talk. Although the Yun family has a summoner, it is only a flash in the pan. Not to mention that hundreds of years have passed. Guarding the huge family business is unavoidable from prying eyes, and those snobbish families actually want to spy on the Yun family's property. The methods have gradually become vicious, and in the end, they have become even more severely harming the Yun family's direct bloodline. The Yun family is in decline, but the pride and self-esteem in the Yun family's bones has existed for thousands of years. The glorious past of the family is the pride of every Yun family, and becoming a summoner is the dream of every generation of the Yun family. Summoner. Yun family. Yun Feng muttered to himself while lying on the bed, his black eyes were constantly surging with light, and finally he slowly raised the corners of his mouth. His mental power was weak. Are you destined to not go far on the spiritual path? Then this theory is destined to end here. In her previous life, she was taken to the research institute because of her terrifying brainwave ability, and brainwave is what the world calls mental power. Slowly closed her eyes, breathing the familiar and unfamiliar air, and when they opened it again, a fierce and fiery burst of fierceness burst out of the black eyes. Summoner, she would make Yun family a second summoner. In the ancestral hall of the Yun family, the layout is simple and solemn. The tablets of each generation of the patriarch of the Yun family stand here. At this time, a middle-aged man with a tight expression is standing in the silent ancestral hall, who is the patriarch of the Yun family. Klaus Scape. The look of the middle-aged man is handsome. Although he is middle-aged, he has a strong body and does not have too many wrinkles on his face. His facial features are faintly heroic, but his black eyes have a touch of sadness at this moment. The middle-aged man's gaze always stopped right above the family tablet. There was a portrait hanging on it. The man in the scroll had a short black hair. His smile was calm and gentle and elegant, but the temperament that burst out from the whole body only came from the painting. You can still feel real here. This is a man who can laugh at everything. He is an absolute strong, and he is the only summoner that has appeared in the Yun family for generations. Ancestor, Yun Jing is ashamed to the Yun family. Yun Jing muttered to himself, his whole body suddenly knelt down, and a huge sound was made from his knees on the ground. Upon closer inspection, Yun Jing was kneeling on the ground. Slightly collapsed. Yun Jing closed his eyes and lowered his head, his body stiffened with stubbornness. The pride and self-esteem in the Yun family's blood made him feel ashamed of himself in front of this ancestor of the Yun family. The Yun family has been shining, and no one can match it, but with the departure of the ancestors of the summoners, the light is getting weaker and lighter. Every generation of patriarch bears an unspeakable heavy responsibility. The summoners appear in the Yun family. Every generation has hope, and every generation has failed. Except for the great ancestor, there is no second summoner in the Yun family. The glory and dignity accumulated over many generations make the Yun family never give up hope. Even so, they firmly believe that the Yun family and the summoner are predestined, and since they can become an ancestor, they will surely become the next. However, hope is good after all. Since the development of the Yun family, the huge family business has been eaten away a lot without the protection of sufficient strength. Now the wealth owned by the Yun family is only 1/1000th of what it was in its heyday. Compared with the past, what is now declining is pitiful. Not only that, the history that made the Yun family proud has now become the scars of others whipping them. The white eyes and ridicule of other families have become more and more fierce. Someone once said that the ancestor of the summoner was just accidental. The declining Yun family was struggling to survive under the suppression of the big family, and the population became thinner and thinner due to various reasons. In this generation, Yun Jing has only 3 children under his knees, and Yun Jing's brothers have also been early left. Originally, Yun Jing had 2 sons, but his second son, Yun Kai, was murdered by conspiracy. His wife also left, and the already thin Yun family was even worse. The family property was exploited everywhere, suppressed and insulted by other families everywhere, and he gritted his teeth because he had 2 children, the Yun family. There are 2 more bloodlines. But Yun Feng is dead, and the bottom line of this man is broken. He can no longer bear it. Forbearance does not mean being deceived, and silence does not mean not breaking out. His daughter died, one of his sons died, and his wife also went. All this hatred erupted at this moment, like a fire that could not be extinguished. Revenge. Even if the jade and stone are burned, even if it is his own life, his Yun family's blood debt, it is time for people to pay it back. Ancestor, Yun Jing is not filial, the Yun family is going to fall into my hands after all. Yun Jing raised his head, his eyes were slightly wet, that was the grief that the burden on his shoulders could not provoke. The Yun family is about to suffer from his complete depression. With the palms clenched tightly, the blue veins burst out, even if he knew that the consequences of doing so would completely deter the Yun family, and even have no chance of re-emergence, even if he knew that doing so would ruin everything in the Yun family, Yun Jing didn't want to stop there. Up! What else can he lose? Son, wife, now a daughter. The Yun family still has Sheng'er, as long as Yun Sheng is still there, the Yun family's blood will not be exhausted. And it's time for those people to pay the price. Bang bang bang! He slammed 3 times on the ground. Yun Jing's forehead had already slightly oozes bleeding, but he didn't seem to feel the pain. His black eyes stubbornly looked at the ancestor's scroll above. Ancestor, please forgive Yun Jing for his unfilial piety. The indifferent man smiling on the scroll is still smiling, but his smile is full of arrogance and domineering, just like the dignity of the Yun family's pride, not to be deceived. Father, father! There was a scream outside. Yun Jing frowned, stood up from the ground. What Sheng'er was doing so anxiously, could it be? Yun Jing opened the door of the ancestral hall with a bang. No one was allowed to enter the ancestral hall without his permission, even his children. So when Yun Sheng saw his father appearing from the ancestral hall, he was slightly taken aback. Hastily ran over. Sheng'er, is it possible that the Lin family is here again? Yun Jing walked over quickly, frowning even tighter. If the Lin family really came this time, Yun Jing would never let them provoked and insulted him, he would go back fiercely. No, father! Yun Sheng ran in a hurry, took a sigh of relief, and then said with a shaking voice, yes, Feng'er, she is not dead. What are you talking about? Even if it is a calm cloud scene, even if it is a cloud scene where emotions are not exposed, it is difficult to restrain the excitement in the heart at this time. Yun Feng, not dead. His daughter is still alive. How can that be? Father, Feng'er is not dead, really not dead. Yun Sheng said loudly, repeating. He and his father couldn't believe it, but the lifeless person on the bed opened his eyes again. He was right. I heard it right, she called his elder brother, and his baby sister was indeed not dead. Taking a big step away, Yun Jing actually glided forward a distance of tens of meters like the wind. Yun Sheng was slightly startled, and then hurriedly followed behind. watching his father's tight back and Yun Sheng's eyes. Slightly red, every generation of the Yun family is under heavy pressure. Yun Jing's generation is even worse. Yun Sheng has been a sensible child since he was a little boy. He understood his father's sufferings and difficulties, so he knew how to take care of his younger siblings at a very young age. Let his father worry about them, but the Yun family still did not have a summoner. Although his father has not changed, he sees his father's disappointment. The longer the depression erupts, the more tragic it will be. Yun Sheng only needs to think about it. Yun Feng is really going to do something his father would do this time, and he can't help feeling fear and sorrow. Fortunately, Feng'er is not dead, she is still alive. Yun Jing's muscles were tight at this moment. The news that Yun Feng was not dead made him ecstatic. The steps under his feet were like the wind, but he suddenly stopped a few meters in front of Yun Feng's house. Yun Jing suppressed his frantic mood, and then slowly pushed the door and walked in slowly. When he saw the person lying on the bed looking at him with a pair of black eyes smiling and full of smiles, Yun Jing only felt sour in his heart, and a flow of heat suddenly moved toward him. Eye sockets flushed away. His daughter is not dead, his daughter is still there, and she is alive. Yun Feng, who was lying on the bed, had already noticed that he was coming since Yun Jing appeared outside the door. When he saw a middle-aged man with a serious face appeared in front of him, Yun Feng knew that this was his father, the father who said he wanted to avenge her at all costs. Yun Feng, who could not speak, could only use his eyes to convey the message that he was okay. Although his father was expressionless, Yun Feng knew that the excitement in this man's heart could not be expressed at this moment. His father didn't come over, let alone talk to her softly. Yun Feng didn't care about it at all. The father and daughter looked at each other at a distance, and they understood each other's feelings through their eyes. Yun Sheng walked in, looked at his father's still serious appearance and couldn't help shaking his head. He walked to Yun Feng's side. His black eyes were filled with relief and pity. Since childhood, Yun Sheng has acted as a half-mother, when his second brother and his mother succeeded. After his death, Yun Sheng was Yun Feng's closest person. In this cold and serious Yun family, only Yun Sheng could make Yun Feng feel a little warm. Feng'er needs to get better soon, you know. Yun Feng moved her neck with difficulty, and the look in Yun Sheng's eyes brought some comfort. She will get better, and she will get better as quickly as possible. Unknowingly, she has completely taken the role of Yun Feng. And the Yun family has also become the root of her heart. Yun Feng's healing process went smoothly. The Yun family didn't know how many gold coins they had spent. Anyway, the most expensive and best medicinal materials were boiled into potions every day. Every day I was infused with precious medicines. If Yun Feng's body does not get better quickly, it's impossible to justify. During the period of time when his body is gradually recovering, Yun Feng also feels strangely that his soul is slowing down with his body. Perfectly fused together. At first, the soul and the body were not very fit, and even trance might appear. Now, they are truly fit together, perfect. Yun Feng has always been taken care of by Yun Sheng himself. It is not that the Yun family has no servants. Although the family background has fallen, the vast wealth of the Yun family has made countless people jealous. She began to persuade the eldest brother not to be so tired and let the servants take care of her, but Yun Sheng rejected them. In Yun Sheng's heart, Yun Feng is his treasure, and he finally survived, and let him take good care of him, and the servant takes care of his beloved sister. How can this be? What if there is something? So Yun Sheng is here at Yun Feng, everything is done by himself. Yun Feng said that after seeing his eldest brother a few times, he would still be me, so he just followed him. In these days of being carefully taken care of, the power of family affection made Yun Feng always feel that she was lucky. The elder brother who took care of her meticulously, as a man with such a careful mind, even comparable to a woman, looked serious towards her. But the black-faced father who cares no less than her elder brother, this is all Yun Feng's wealth, these two people she desperately wants to protect. On the day when she was in perfect health, Yunfeng got off the bed, carefully moved her muscles and bones, and walked to the mirror. She hadn't taken a good look at this face yet. The mirror is a very tender face, delicate and lovely, very beautiful. Yunfeng looked at him blankly, and then he took a look at his body afterwards. Yunfeng is only 9 years old this year. Thinking in front of the mirror, Yunfeng's body was suddenly picked up gently by a strong force, and then a familiar voice sounded with a slight accusation, "Fenger is not good, why got out of bed without authorization?" Yunfeng curled his lips helplessly, and was hugged into his warm arms. "Big brother, my body has been healed a long time ago." Yes, Yunfeng's body has been healed a long time ago, but Yunsheng insisted on not letting her get out of bed. "I spent several weeks in bed again." Unable to resist, Yunsheng put Yunfeng on the bed again, and finally Yunfeng lay back helplessly under Yunsheng's eyes. This eldest brother, worried that she was really overdoing it. After blinking his black eyes, Yunfeng looked at Yunsheng sitting by the bed. Her eldest brother is a beautiful man after all. His handsome features are very charming, and her eldest brother is a magical genius that is rare in the Yun family in a century. Although magician is not a difficult occupation, but for the people of the eastern continent, because of the natural system, there are very few who can become magician. Yunsheng can become a magician with the quality, which is also very surprising. Envious. It's great that eldest brother can become a magician. Yunfeng said with a smile. Yunsheng looked at his baby sister deeply, and finally touched her cheek gently with his big hand, very emotional. Fenger will become a great warrior in the future, and my eldest brother will be proud of you. There are many regrets and regrets in the words. Every child in the Yun family will conduct a test from birth to determine whether they can become a summoner, a teacher and a magician, and Yunfeng has nothing to do with both. There are only 2 ways for her to go. Either be an ordinary person or become a brave warrior, but the road to training a warrior is again such hardship. For a girl Yunfeng, how hard it is. Yunfeng smiled and didn't say anything. She noticed the unusually strong mental power in her body. It seems that the reason that the soul and the body completely fit has improved her originally terrifying mental power. Yunfeng is now a few hundred meters away. Everything within can be clearly perceived, which is also the function of mental power to perceive objects. Warrior? Yunfeng smiled in his heart. The summoner and the magician are powerful, but if you fight on with the warrior, the same level is okay. If you cross the level, the warrior above your own level can still hold the summoner under your feet. The summoner is not invincible, but the strength of the summoner also makes it difficult to leapfrog. A fighter who is 1 or 2 levels higher than himself can only admit defeat in front of the summoner. Unless it is 4 or 5 levels higher, the summoner will be made defeated. The shaping of the body has always been the shortcoming of the other 2. Even if they have powerful abilities, they will still be easily strangled by warriors. Therefore, Yunfeng decided that she not only wants to be a summoner, but also a warrior. She needs to be strong. Great body and extraordinary physique. This is actually an incredible idea. The world can accept that a summoner can be a magician. After all, both belong to the category of spiritual power, but if a summoner is a warrior, I am afraid that everyone will stare out. Now, this a shocking thought is about to be put into action by Yunfeng. Big brother, don't worry, Fenger will definitely not let him down. Yunfeng pulled out a smile, and Yunsheng also laughed. He was helplessly pressed by his elder brother Yunsheng on the bed for a few days before Yunfeng was able to truly get out of the bed and walked outside to take a breath of fresh air. Yunfeng looked around. The Yun family's house is not very big, although it is an ancient family that has passed on for thousands of years, but it was simple and unusual, perhaps because the Yun family was sparsely populated, and no matter how big the house was, it would only appear more lonely. The scale of the Yun family's family home now is more like an ordinary family, perhaps only a little larger than the ordinary family. No one can see that this is a glorious family that once stood at the top of the Karen Empire. Looking across a closed door, Yunfeng's eyes sank slightly. There is the Yun family's ancestral hall, which is dedicated to the memorial tablet of the Yun family's head, and there is also a portrait of the ancestor of the Yun family's summoner, Yunfeng. She has been reborn at this moment. She was taken into the ancestral hall once when she was young, to perform the so-called test, and the vague memory of her childhood also made her completely unable to remember how this ancestor grew up and what kind of demeanor she would be. She wanted to enter the ancestral hall again. Thinking of this, his father Yunjing walked in from the outside. Because of Yunfeng's physical improvement, Yunjing's complexion was more than twice as good as the previous period. Now he sees his daughter standing in front of him in such a healthy manner. Yunjing's heart was very happy. Father! Yunfeng's respectful salute to Yunjing. The Yun family's tutor is very strict, and is not negligent in etiquette. Although the Yun family is not as good as before, everyone in the Yun family has an arrogance in their hearts. Yunjing Jun nodded, and realized that Yunfeng's line of sight was looking at the direction of the ancestral hall just now. Yunjing thought for a while, and said lightly, Feng wants to enter the ancestral hall. Yunfeng was taken aback, and then relieved. His father is a 5th-level martial artist, and it is only natural to be able to catch her sight. He nodded. Yunjing said nothing, but his body moved slightly and he had already walked in the direction of the ancestral hall. To go, Yunfeng immediately followed. The classification of occupation levels in the vast continent is very simple. Levels 1 to 9, which are the most well-known levels. Levels 1 to 3 are called elementary, levels 3 to 6 are called intermediate, and levels 7 to 9 are called advanced. The 8th and 9th ranks are among the best in the empire. It can be said that it is not an exaggeration to look down upon the best. And after level 9 is the command level. This level is rarely known by people. The strong of this class and the ordinary class will become a clear level difference, like a watershed, and there will be essential differences in power. The command level is not the power that the empire can have, it belongs to some mysterious forces that are higher than the empire, and above the command is the monarch level, which is divided into junior high and high levels. It is extremely difficult to reach the monarch level every level. People who can reach this level are the strong among the strong, and they don't often appear in people's field of vision in important positions. Above the monarch is a more illusory existence. The venerable level is also divided into junior high school and high school. These powerful people are all enchanting existences in the eyes of the world. No one has seen them take action. No one is sure whether such a strong person really exists. If the venerable level makes a move, let alone a small country, even an empire can be turned into scorched earth in an instant. And what kind of realm is above the nobleman, no one knows, no human being has reached it. In the tens of thousands of years of evolution, based on constant speculation, maybe only the realm above the noble appears within the beast. If it does appear, it must be a disaster for mankind. The door of the ancestral hall was opened by Yunjing, and a cold air rushed over his face. Yunfeng couldn't help tensing his body with a solemn expression. He followed Yunjing into the ancestral hall. Yunfeng slightly raised his head and saw the wall. In the secondary picture scroll, the man in the scroll with a faint smile but a arrogant suit is the ancestor of the summoner. Kneel down. As soon as Yunjing's words fell, Yunfeng's knees fell on the ground, with pious and inexplicable respect, facing the man in the picture and the Yun family's patrons. Does Feng know who these tablets are? Feng knows, the generational patriarch of the Yun family. Yunjing Jun nodded, his eyes looked at the scroll, his black eyes flickered. Feng, can you tell who is on the scroll? Yunfeng nodded. Yunjing did not speak any more, stood beside Yunfeng in silence for a long time, and then sighed softly, mixed with a lot of helplessness and exhaustion. Since the ancestors of the Yun family, there has never been a summoner. Is this the problem of the Yun family or is it a trick from heaven? Yunfeng knelt there, pursing the corners of her lips, only to feel that a fire was burning in her heart. Summoner, she must become a summoner. Yunjing slowly walked to the position where the tablet was placed. I don't know where I pressed it. Yunfeng only heard the sound of the dark grid. He waited for a while. When his father turned around again, there was an extra one in his hand. The shining stone. Looking at the stone, Yunfeng faintly felt that the spiritual power in his body seemed to be approaching this stone, and it seemed that the stone had an inexplicable suction, pulling her spiritual power out. Yunfeng was startled, and immediately stabilized the mental power that was about to move within his body. He looked at that strange stone. Yunfeng's forehead was sweating slightly. What exactly was that stone? Seeing the appearance of Yunjing holding the stone so solemnly, and the stone was taken out of the hidden compartment of this ancestral hall, it must be the most precious thing in the Yun family. Yunfeng secretly guessed that Yunjing spoke again, looking at the stone in his palm. There is an indefinite expectation. Cut the soul? Yunfeng thought to himself, how powerful is the summoner, can even the soul be cut? As if he had guessed what Yunfeng was thinking, the ancestor smiled faintly, little guy, the summoner is very powerful, 1,000 times, 10,000 times stronger than you think. When you reach that height, you will have a personal experience. Yunfeng nodded. There is almost no experience to learn from on the road of the summoner. It has been 200 years since the appearance of the last summoner in the eastern continent. She was looking for a mentor. Fortunately, she now has an ancestor. This undoubtedly prevents her from taking a lot of detours. Little guy, once the news that you are a summoner goes out, it is estimated that the eastern continent will be shaken by it. Yunfeng smiled faintly, I don't want to hide this news from my ancestors. Oh? Why? Don't you want the Yun family to recover to its original highest point? No, I really want to, as the Yun family, naturally I want to shine and shine, this is what I should and must do. Then why? Not only do I want to be a summoner, I also want to be a warrior. Yunfeng's words left the ancestor completely speechless, slightly opened his mouth in a daze, and stood there as if he had seen a ghost. After a long time, he even laughed, with endless admiration in his eyes. The little guy is really different, the mental power in his body is amazing, and his thoughts are also amazing. Did you know that the summoner himself is a magician? Yunfeng nodded. Summoners and magicians belong to the same category of spiritual power, and both use their own spiritual power to communicate and use world elements. However, the summoner can control the beast, and the magician can only use the elements. You said you want to become a fighter. Do you know that this means that you have to practice 3 professions at the same time? If you let those old guys who are still alive know about it, you will be scared to death. Yunfeng smiled slightly, I don't want to be a strong person who can't help being weak, and I don't want to be a fool who can be strangled by opponents at any time. Since I am a strong person, I won't leave any chance for my opponent to kill myself. Will not give others the idea that they can beat themselves. When the ancestor heard this, there was a smile in his black eyes. Although this girl's thoughts were a bit shocking, but they were deeply in his heart. This arrogant temperament was somewhat similar to him, and it was indeed a child of his Yun family. Very well, now that you have an idea, do it firmly and don't hold back any more. Yunfeng smiled, only to feel that he had a backing. The ancestor's backing was very large and very high. For Yunfeng, just a word from the ancestor could give her endless courage and motivation to move forward courageously. By the way, did you almost die, kid? Yunfeng was surprised by what the ancestor said, and the ancestor smiled, I entered your spiritual space and naturally saw your memory. What do you plan to do? How to do? Yunfeng's whole body suddenly exudes an air conditioning. The coldness can almost freeze his breath. The eldest son of the Lin family killed Yunfeng. If it weren't for her, Yunfeng would really be dead. Naturally, such a debt would be required. Also, it's not a day or two for the Lin family to peek at the Yun family's property, and the tragic death of her second brother is also inextricably linked to the Lin family. All of these must be returned by the Lin family one by one. Naturally, I have to pay it back, but not now. I am too weak now, and I don't have the slightest ability to fight back against the Lin family, let alone the other members of the Lin family. Humph, those people are going to die sooner or later. Those who dare to move the Yun family will not live for too long. The ancestor's smile just now became gloomy, and the warm smile on the corner of his mouth was also evil and hideous. Yun Feng only felt warmth in his heart. 3 months. 3 months later is the day I entered the martial arts academy. When I get there, I will kill him myself. 3 months. The ancestor was a little surprised, and then laughed again, very arrogant, those eyes that were as deep as the night sky dazzled. Little guy, do you look at yourself too low? Too low? Yun Feng wondered, is his current strength very high? She has not practiced any practice at all. This body is just a change of soul. The only thing she has done during this period is probably the fusion of soul and body. Now if you contract a monster of the same level, not to mention the miscellaneous fur of the Lin family, even if the entire Chunfeng town wants to be flattened, it will be easy. Yun Feng's breathing suddenly tightened, and she felt that she had heard a very incredible sentence. She couldn't believe it, but she had to believe it. If this was spoken by someone else, even a high-level powerhouse, she would be a little skeptical, but it turned out to be the ancestor, this great summoner. Am I very good? This may be a very silly and naive question, but it is the question that Yun Feng most urgently wants to know. What is her current ability, what level is it, and why is she calming the spring breeze? The town is easy, to level a small town, that is at least something that a middle-level warrior or a magician can do. Could it be that she has reached the middle level now? How can that be? Little guy, although your strength is not very high right now, you are still unrivaled among your peers. Even those who claim to be geniuses are not comparable to you. The ancestors even spoke in his tone. With a trace of pride, Black Eyes smiled a little. How about your strength? You still have the opportunity to feel it for yourself. Hearing the words of his ancestors, Yun Feng couldn't stop the rapid beating of his heart. There was no one among his peers. Even a genius was incomparable with himself. If even a genius could not be compared, what would he be? Is there a more genius than a genius? Perceiving the slight shock in Yun Feng's heart, the ancestors only smiled faintly, as if she wanted her to digest the news by herself. Living in the spiritual space inside Yun Feng's body, the ancestors could more directly touch Yun Feng's spiritual power. In fact, the ancestors felt astonished at the moment they just entered Yun Feng's body. The mental power contained in this little guy's body unexpectedly made him feel unfathomable for a moment. Who is he? He is one of the only 5 summoners born in the eastern continent for thousands of years, and he is not ashamed to say that he is the strongest one. The summoner is even more proficient in the understanding of the elements and spiritual power than the magician, and with his detection, he can't detect the limit of the spiritual power in this little guy's body. What does this mean? This means that this little guy may even surpass himself in the future growth process. Because of the physique of the eastern continent, there are very few people who can show spiritual power in the body, and it is even harder to see those who are full of energy. Like Yunfen, the most powerful person can't detect the low, and it can be said to be the first to break the world up. If the ancestors of the Yun family were still alive, it would be absolutely impossible to let go of such a seedling that could be called an evildoer. Looking at the vast mainland, how many people could possess such potential? If Yun Feng was born in a contemporary noble family, he would already be a genius girl out of reach of the stars Gongaiu. While sighing, the ancestors also had a faint pride in their hearts. Such enchanting seedlings were born in the eastern continent, and they were born in the Yun family. If such a monster grows up and turns out to be born, thinking of the scene at that time, the ancestors can't help but laugh. Ancestor, what's the matter with you? Hearing the ancestors' low laughter, Yunfeng suddenly felt a creepy feeling. This feeling, how did it seem to be calculated by someone? Ahem, it's okay, little guy, what martial arts school are you sure you are going to go to for the training of fighters? The words of the ancestors caused Yunfeng to frown slightly. If she had a choice, she didn't want to go to some Reishi Zaiwu Academy. The only reason to return there was to solve the miscellaneous hair of the Lin family. At present, besides the martial arts school, there are systematic besides the professor, who can she call to teach? An ancestor? The ancestor was a summoner, and he was not proficient in the way of warriors. Yunfeng couldn't help feeling a little when he thought of this. However, Yunfeng didn't think about it. Sanxiu, this idea might only come to her when looking at the whole continent. Feeling Yunfeng's sadness, the ancestor smiled again. He seemed to particularly like seeing Yunfeng's frowning face. With a wave of the ancestor's hand, Yunfeng only felt something flying out of her spiritual space. Suddenly when I opened my eyes, I saw a pure black bracelet floating in front of me, which seemed to emit a strange light. This is the bracelet of space, put it on quickly. Yunfeng's ancestor's words came from Yunfeng's mind. Yunfeng nodded and put the bracelet on his wrist without any hesitation. The moment he put it on, it seemed to be spiritual. It usually fits tightly on Yunfeng's skin, and finally disappeared quietly. No, no more. Looking at his empty wrist, Yunfeng couldn't help blinking a few times before disappearing out of thin air. Where did you go? Haha, don't be so surprised, the little guy, he looks like he has never seen the world. The ancestor's slightly ridiculous voice sounded, saying that the ancestor has not known how long he has been alive, nor does he know what height he is standing on. Right now, in front of Yunfeng, there is no such thing as a strong person or an elder, and it can be seen that the second summoner of the Yun family, the ancestor, is very fond. As long as her mind moves, it will reappear. According to the ancestor's words, Yunfeng tried to do it. As her mind moved, the bracelet really appeared again, and her mind moved again and disappeared strangely. This is space magic. Only magicians who reach the commander level can perform it. In the final analysis, it is just a tricky trick. The ancestor's breath made Yunfeng almost fainted. This kind of magic is only small. Means? Commander level magic. What level of magic was a great technique in the eyes of the ancestors? Okay, little guy, that's the gift I gave you. Go in and have a look. The ancestor's tone was eager, like a child offering a treasure. Yunfeng smiled slightly, and immediately called out the bracelet. The consciousness also easily entered. When Yunfeng entered the inner space of the bracelet, she was once again completely shocked. Inside the bracelet is a space of 20 square meters. Yunfeng doesn't know how big the other storage containers are, but the current one seems to be considered superior. The space was full of various things, and Yunfeng glanced at it and found that there were no less than dozens of things, everything in the world. What kind of little guy, my collection is very rich. The ancestor's proud voice sounded. Yunfeng smiled, nodded, and glanced over the pile of things. Yunfeng had a headache. It was indeed very rich. Look. Everything is precious, but for her now, she doesn't use it at all. The things are good, but they are useless. Since there was nothing suitable for her now, Yunfeng didn't have the thought to look at it, and scanned it again, and suddenly found a pure black jade pendant lying there quietly next to a lot of things. His mind moved, and the jade pendant flew out of space and landed in Yunfeng's palm. The jade pendant started with a feeling of coldness. It seemed that the jade pendant was made of cold ice and shot straight into Yunfeng's body. Yunfeng suddenly felt as if he was immersed in an ice cave. Ancestor, what is this? After stabilizing his mind, Yunfeng carefully observed the jade pendant and asked the ancestor curiously, but the answer she got made her laugh. This thing is mine. The ancestor's words made Yunfeng helplessly convulse the corners of his mouth. The ancestor's soul may have survived for too long, so he can't remember his own things. I rubbed the jade pendant thinly, completely black, and seemed to be carved from a piece of jade. Yunfeng turned the jade pendant over, and then I saw that the jade pendant was carved with a pattern on the north side, and this pattern can be seen in Yunfen. At the first glance, I felt a little dizzy. Firmly stabilized his spirit, looked at it again. Yunfeng could see clearly, the black jade pendant was engraved on the back of a giant creature, and the skeleton-like skeletons of the whole body were intertwined, like a dragon entrenched like a dragon. Together, there is no flesh and blood, only abrupt bones, and above the bone is a closed dragon head. Although the longan has not been opened, Yunfeng seems to be able to predict how violent and the opened eyes will be.